We live in an age where, for some of us, sometimes it's hard to reconcile science and religion, or science and the existence of a creator, while for others it's a continuous antagonism between science and faith, and usually one is rejected, and it's usually the case that faith is rejected. Still, for others, there is no antagonism, and there is no need to reconcile, and both science and faith can exist perfectly well, and there is no problem. Now, why do we have these differences between the way we perceive science and religion? I believe these differences exist based on the differences in our worldviews. A worldview is the window or the frame through which we observe life. The frame through which, or the window through which we have a place for God or not, man, and the universe. So how these three exist, their place in relation to one another, and the relationship between these three forms the core of our worldview. Different people have different worldviews. Some are based on secular principles, some worldviews are more philosophical, some are based on belief systems. Some worldviews do not have a place for God. There is no God, and the worldview is basically the place of man in relation to the universe and the relationship between man and the universe. Now, if you subscribe to this worldview and you don't believe in the existence of God, and you don't believe that science or the discoveries of science are basically explaining how God created the universe, then you may not be interested in this recording. However, if you subscribe to a worldview, a theistic worldview, where you believe in the existence of God, okay, but sometimes you find it confusing when some certain scientific discoveries come about, and you listen to other secular worldviews, and then your faith gets shaken, or you seem to be confused about what is happening here. Now, this recording might help. I believe why this happens in theistic worldviews, why sometimes people who believe in God, their faith gets a little bit shaken, or they have questions regarding the relationship between science and religion. I believe it can be due to a number of reasons. One of them is that these individuals are not aware, they're not conscious of their worldview. They have not sat down and actually reflected upon how they view God, man, the universe, the relationship, and so on. So basically what happens to these individuals is that they are sometimes hear a good explanation how science is explaining the universe, how man is creating things in the universe. That sounds well to them. And so they adopt that. And then they drift when they hear a priest or a sheikh or an imam talk about, for example, God's relationship to man. And they like that. And so they adopt that. But they are unaware of the worldview that they are drawing for themselves. It's bits and pieces that they are not aware of them and how they are connected. And so they're drifters of worldviews. And so to these drifters, then any little breeze that comes in will disturb the already very fragile structure that they have. And that creates confusion between science and religion. The other reason, I think, sometimes people sit down and they actually figure out their worldview, but they have a mosaic worldview. They actually are conscious and they pick and choose different pieces of different worldviews. So they take some part of the secular worldview, some part of philosophical worldview, some part of the theistic worldview, and they try to paste them together, copy-paste method of a worldview. Now that copy-paste might work when the subject or the issue that they deal with is present in one piece of that worldview. For example, a small piece that exists explains man's relationship with the universe, where science might fall, and then they have a good explanation. But when the question comes relating different pieces which he took or she took from different worldviews, then that will not work, because they don't fit together. It's not a cohesive worldview. And so when a disturbance or a storm comes talking about science and religion, it might shake the foundation on which their worldview is built. Now, the third reason, I think, also relates to the origin of that worldview. I might have a worldview that is cohesive. It's all the same, it's all theistic, but I believe sometimes if the origin of that worldview is not entirely based on a divine source, and a lot of human interpretation came into it, explaining things that are usually should be left for the divine, then we have problems when the issue comes challenging the divine relationships. And I think sometimes this is what happens for believers who do believe in a certain worldview. For those people, I think I encourage them to check their worldview, to check the sources, and to understand what is man-made in that worldview and what is divine. Now, the purpose of this presentation or this recording is to put forward a worldview, a comprehensive, I'm not presenting the whole worldview, I am presenting parts of a divine worldview, which is the Islamic theology. I'm presenting parts of it that relate into explaining the relationship between a specific aspect of science, that is human cloning, and faith. Does human cloning affect our belief in the existence of God? So I will be presenting parts of the Islamic theology worldview, parts that relate into delineating the relationship between the two, and showing that there is no antagonism between science and theology through the Islamic worldview. First, I would like to draw the frame for this presentation. The main question that the presentation will revolve around addressing or answering is this question: should our ability to clone humans negatively affect our belief in the existence of God or existence of a creator? Basically, is there an antagonism between science and faith? Now, I'm going to approach this by addressing three aspects to this question. The first one is we need to understand what is human cloning. We need to understand the technology, how it is done in a simplified manner. We need to understand the ramifications of this technology, and we need to understand how this relates to human nature. Are we actually cloning humans? This is, of course, I'm presenting it from the Islamic worldview. Then I'm going to move on to the human action. We need to distinguish between what is human and what is divine in the aspect of human cloning. Is our ability to clone making us divine, equating us with God, and therefore proving that there is no God? So then we have to dissect this a bit further and talk about our human ability. I'm going to talk about two aspects here. I'm going to talk about the actions of man. Now, can this human cloning be considered divine? Is man creating when he actually clones a human? And what is the dominion of man? Is man transgressing when he clones humans? Is he transgressing on the dominion of God and becoming God-like? So that is the second part. Now the third part is we talk about the same thing. We talk about what is divine, what is the dominion of God, in order to understand if man is transgressing on the dominion of God. And then we need to talk about actions of God. Are they the same as the actions of man? Is the act of creation, the divine creation, is it the same as the act of human cloning? And so this is how I'm going to approach this study. Now I'm going to talk about the technology of human cloning. First of all, what is cloning? Cloning is the act of making copies. The copies can be of genes, then it's genetic or gene cloning. It can be cells, it can be making copies of tissues, or it can be making copies of individuals, and in this case of humans, so it becomes human cloning. Cloning started a long time ago in the 80s when scientists cloned the insulin gene, and then they made a recombinant product and produced it and put it into the market. That was the cloning of genes. And then later on, science had more discoveries, and then they did the cloning of individuals, like Dolly the sheep, and therapeutic cloning, where they clone cells. Usually they take stem cells and they clone them in order to make organs and tissues. Now we're going to talk about human cloning. This is the same procedure that they used to clone Dolly the sheep. Now this is an individual, a human. I want to clone, make a copy of the whole individual. And so what scientists did is that they take a skin cell from this individual, and they keep the nucleus and they discard the rest of the cell. And then they take a human ova from a volunteer and they discard the nucleus. We don't want the genetic material of that ova. We want the genetic material of that individual that we are going to clone. And so what they do is they put the genetic material of that individual inside the ova. So the ova is like the carrier, or it provides all the necessary environment now for the development of this egg. And so now we have an egg or an ova, and inside it the genetic material of the individual we want to clone. And so what they do is they expose it to an electrical current, or give it an electrical shock. They found that when they do that, the cell somehow gets shocked, and now it thinks that it's a fertilized ovum. And it has a complete now number of chromosomes, of course, because it came from an adult cell. So now the shocked ovum thinks it's a fertilized egg. And so what happens is that it starts to divide like a regular fertilized ovum. And then you have an embryo. And now, if this is therapeutic cloning, and this is where all the arguments are about, when you take embryonic stem cells, this is where embryonic stem cells come from. You generate an embryo, and then it's about between 4 and 6 days old. You take this bigger lump of cells that you see. These are stem cells. It's like a big ball that's hollow, with these stem cells at one side. And so they put in a needle and they suck those stem cells, and they discard the rest of the embryo. And then they take these stem cells and cultivate them, culture them, and then try to induce them to differentiate into, for example, skin cells, heart cells, whatever they want to produce to help cure that individual. So this is therapeutic cloning. Now in human cloning, people don't do that, scientists don't do that. So after the embryo is produced, it is 4 to 6, or maybe they can grow it a little bit more outside the womb. They take that embryo, now it's dividing embryo, and they implant it in the uterus of a volunteer woman, and then at the end the woman carries it for full term, and then the baby is born. Now, is this feasible? Has it been done? No, not yet. This has been done in animals. It was first done with sheep, and in 1996, Dolly the sheep was made. They cloned it from the cells of the udder of a sheep, It was 6-year-old, the sheep, and then they implanted the embryo in the uterus of another ewe, and then they got Dolly the sheep. Now at that time they went through 277 attempts or ova in order to produce one Dolly, and so it is very inefficient. And of course the result was that Dolly, it looked like the original ewe from which they took the cell, but it had it got old very quickly, because the DNA itself is 6 years old, and so she became old very quickly and developed a number of diseases, and so she lived 6 years, and then they had to put her down. Now science has developed a lot since 1996, and scientists have cloned a number of other animals, and the number of ova has been decreasing because the efficiency has been increasing. Now the interesting part is that last year in May 2013, a scientist, Vitaly Pov, succeeded in producing a human embryo. So he did all these steps up to the stage of an embryo, and he did that from an 8-month-old baby. Now he's doing that for therapeutic cloning, to collect cells to be used to treat that baby. But of course, if you reach that stage, then the only part left is to implant that embryo in the uterus of a volunteer woman and get a human clone. Now this year, in April 2014, 2 other labs were able to repeat that experiment. And they were able to start from individuals, taking skin cells from individuals that are 35-year-old man and 75-year-old man, and they were still able to reach the step where they created an embryo. So it is working. So we have now scientifically reached that point, and the efficiency now, it's not using 277 ovum. They actually used up about 76 to 77 ova in the process. They took them from volunteers and they paid them to get the ova. So theoretically and practically, we have reached the embryo stage. So of course it is illegal to clone humans in most countries. But I give it a few years before somebody actually puts that embryo in the uterus and declares that he have created the first human clone. It's not ethical, but it is doable. Now this is the technique of human cloning. Now what are the ramifications of this technology? And this is what usually scares people, and people vote against human cloning and so on. So what pops up in people's minds, for example, is that, well, if we do human cloning, then we can clone our loved ones if they die. If the daughter dies, if the wife dies, the husband dies, the spouse can take cells and then clone her husband, or she can clone her son back, and not miss them so much. Also, we can, for the sick, we can clone if a son is sick and he has a certain genetic disease or something, or he needs a kidney, or he needs some kind of organ, then they can clone him. If he can live that long, they can clone him, and then he has a clone, and that clone, they can take the kidney or whatever organ they need. Of course, if it's dangerous, then that clone is dead, and if it is not, then they can still take that kidney, for example, from that clone and use it to treat the original patient. Of course, this way they overcome organ rejection and all that problems that comes with organ rejection. Or some people are thinking, well, we can clone the brains that came through history. We can clone Einstein. We can clone or all those other scientists and the social thinkers and so on. Maybe they can help us to figure out how to solve existing problems in the world. Others were thinking, okay, the ramifications is that we can cure infertility. There are certain couples who, up to the current technology, they cannot have children of their own. They're infertile. And so this technology, these couples, they can clone one of them and have children that are in a way, from them or from one of them. And this way we overcome infertility in some cases. Or, for example, certain couples, they cannot reproduce sexually, the normal sexual reproduction, because of inherited diseases. And if they do, they're 100% sure that the child is going to have that disease, and they're going to really suffer. So they really can't have children of their own. So instead of adopting or any of these things, if they really want to have a child of their own, then they can clone one of them. Other ramifications is that if you combine this technology, the technology of human cloning. Now, human cloning, the example I gave you, you have IVF technology as well, in vitro fertilization, because in vitro fertilization is where you take a sperm and you take an ovum and then you fertilize them, you incubate them, you have the embryo, and then you put it back into the womb. So the technology I explained to you about human cloning also involves IVF. So in science, lots of techniques get to be used together to create something even bigger. And so if we already combined IVF with human cloning, now combine to that gene therapy, which is probably going to come out in a couple, 2, 3, 4 years. It's already in clinical trials and it's showing a lot of success. So combine gene therapy, combine our knowledge of the genetic code from the Human Genome Project and so on. Then the ramification for this is eugenics. I will know, for example, certain genes are involved in intelligence, certain genes are involved in physical appearances, and so people can start manipulating the embryos and trying to create, for example, a superior race, or the superior soldier, or creating intelligently inferior people who are strong but not too much on intelligence, and use them for labor, and so on. So this is a ramification of how do we use this technology. Now there's also the issue of when we are cloning humans, are we creating immortality, or making a person, they can never die? Whenever, for example, he's reaching 70, he can clone, or 50, he clones himself. And so he has another individual, looks the same, carries the same, genes, and give him the same name, and he keeps going. And then before he dies, or as he gets older, he clones himself again. And so are we creating immortality this way? So these are some of the ramifications that pops up in people's minds, and this is what creates the dilemma about human cloning and creates the confusion. Are we becoming gods? Are we transgressing on the dominion of God? And so this can shake the faith of some believers, as I said, based on their worldview. Now we discussed human cloning, we discussed the ramification, the technology, and I'm going to leave the last part about human nature for a later part. Now, in order to understand how we can get confused when man creates another man, we can get confused about this action that man is transgressing the dominion of God, and that man is becoming a god. So in order to discuss that point, we need to discuss what is the dominion of man and what are man's actions. is human cloning considered a divine act of creation? But before I do that, I want to clarify that in this recording I am not discussing the ethical aspect of human cloning. I am not discussing the jurisprudence part of human cloning. What did the Muslim scholars say about human cloning? Is it ethical? Is it not ethical? I am not going into that discussion. That is left for another part or discipline in Islamic theology. I do not accept human cloning. I don't think it is ethical. But this presentation is not discussing the ethical aspects of this. I'm only discussing that if we do human cloning, why is it causing confusion? Okay, so now we discuss the dominion of man. Now, what is the dominion of man? Now, in order to talk about that, I want to draw an analogy. If I have a very nice classroom equipped with the best teaching facilities and material and everything, and then I put a small child into the classroom and I leave him for an hour with the students or without students, now that child is not equipped. That child does not even have the cognitive abilities to deal or to teach or to use any of the equipment in the classroom. So he's going to wreak havoc in the classroom. But if I bring a newly graduated teacher who has graduated now and they're trained and to do the best kind of teaching and so on, and then I put them in this classroom, now I expect them, they will know how to use the stuff and they will use it in the way it should be used. There's one point to be clear. They can choose not to use it properly. They can choose to abuse it, or they can choose to use it properly. But in any case, they are equipped and trained to use it and understand what it is and so on. Now we move that analogy to the dominion of man. Man, according to other worldviews that are not divine, okay, or copy-paste worldviews or drifters worldviews, man came through evolution. Man has no purpose. He has to survive. So the way we look at man is he is at the bottom of the scale. He is a little bit above animals. And so our expectation of that man is really low in relation to the universe. He is like that child that you put in the classroom. And so what do you expect from that child? To wreak havoc. And so if that child suddenly teaches or be able to use one of these technically advanced teaching apparatus or something, then we are really astonished how he was able to do that. This is, if we have that understanding of the place of man, then we will be surprised. Man created between brackets another human being. So maybe man is becoming God. He is evolving to become God. Maybe later on in 100, 200 years, maybe he creates another universe or something. So that can cause confusion. So science in that worldview can seem antagonistic to belief. But through the Islamic worldview, man is already a trained teacher. He is already the best equipped person to use that classroom and to deliver what should have been delivered. This is how man's place is in the universe, according to the Islamic worldview. So in the Islamic worldview, man is the best of all creatures. God says in many places in the Quran about man's status. Man, I mean human being, not man excluding women. Men and women. And so God said in the Quran to the angels when he created Adam, bow down to Adam. And they bowed down to him. So some scholars even say that man's status is even above angels. Okay, so when we have the Islamic perspective that man's status is already at the top of the scale, he is the trained teacher, that he has the abilities to deliver what he is supposed to deliver. then we're not surprised when man takes hold of the classroom and runs it and uses all the systems that are there in the classroom. So we don't have a confusion that man has created something that he was not able of doing. So this is one point. Now, man is the best of all creatures, and he was given a purpose. He was given a purpose in this life. God says in the Quran, did you think that we had created you in play without a purpose, and that you would not be brought back to us? This is what it says, and there are other verses in the Quran. And so God put man on earth to fulfill a purpose. There's a vertical relationship with God, of servitude relationship with God, that needs to be fulfilled, and it is dependent and related to another horizontal relationship with the universe, a relationship of vicegerency, that man has to uphold God's rules in dealing with the universe, in taking care of the universe. This is the purpose of man. It is clear. So man was not created out of evolution with no purpose, and he has to survive. So when we understand that, and we have the worldview that says man was created the best of creatures, and he was created with a purpose to fulfill in this life, and he was given the abilities and the resources, which is the whole universe, to fulfill that purpose, then we are not surprised when man is capable of great things. And when we see man is capable of great things, it does not shake our belief system. If a teacher is well equipped, she has the training, she has the cognitive abilities, and we put her in the right place to fulfill her duty or her goal, we're not surprised that she takes hold and controls and runs the whole class. But if we think of man as the child who is thrown into a place, and then he suddenly acquires that cognitive ability or technical abilities, then of course we will be shocked. So that is the dominion of man. The dominion of man is the whole universe, and he is given the abilities to fulfill that purpose. Of course, like the teacher, man can choose to do good or choose to do bad, but when he does bad, he doesn't transgress against God, or he is no threat to God. If you believe human cloning is wrong, as I do, then if man does human cloning, he's not a threat to God, okay? But he is transgressing against himself. He is choosing to do wrong. Now we have discussed the dominion of man. Now what about the actions of man? Is man creating? Can we talk about a creation of man as a divine creation? Well, God created the world, and he created the world to follow the law of cause and effect. So he created abilities and qualities in things and in people to act as causes. So man, therefore, has the ability to act as a cause in order to get the desired effect. So to fulfill his role as a vicegerent, then he is obligated to follow that rule of cause and effect. So he can be himself a cause, to get the effects that needed to be done when doing the role of vicegerency. For example, if I am sick and I need to get well, then I have to go through the cause and effects and look for a cure that will help me get rid of the disease, and so on. Now, the difference is the actions of man when he's fulfilling this cause and effect. The action of man himself is not the ultimate action, that without it, that action is not going to be made. In any action that man does, if I want to make a car, or if I want to write an email, or anything, any action that man does, he has to find and provide all the other actions that support to get the end result. I have to have a computer to write the email. I have to be able to type. I have to have the internet there hooked up and so on. I have to have the email of the person that I am going to send the email to. So I have to provide all these circumstances and environment suitable to get that end result achieved. That's one thing. And I have to remove any obstacles that might prevent that end result from being achieved. Now, putting all these circumstances together, removing all the obstacles that need to be removed, are not enough in the Islamic worldview for that action to happen. Because the ultimate factor that without which that achievement is not going to happen is the will of God. The will of God is the ultimate factor. If God does not will that email to go through, it doesn't matter if I put all the circumstances and remove all the obstacles, it will not go through. So man can act. Man can act in this universe, but he cannot act independent of the will of God. God says in the Quran, but you cannot will it unless God wills. For behold, God is indeed all-knowing and wise. And so man's action, he can act. He was given the abilities by God to act in that dominion, in all the seen and visible and physical dominion. But his actions are dependent always and always on the will of God. Now, we have discussed the abilities, the dominion and the actions of man. Now, how do these compare with the dominion of God and the actions of God? So now let's talk about the dominions and actions of God and see how they compare with that of man. Now, in the Islamic theology, the world did not create itself and come by chance. God is the creator, owner of the whole universe, the physical and the metaphysical part. This is an important fact, he is the sustainer. So God did not create the world, because some people have that worldview, is that God created the universe like a clockmaker made the clock, and then he left the universe or left the clock to tick by itself. So he does not sustain it, he does not take care of it. This is not the Islamic worldview. God is a sustainer, so he is totally aware of what is happening. He has the knowledge and the wisdom, and he knows everything that is happening. If man is going to attempt cloning, if man is going to do wrong things, abuse the universe in a wrong way, God is aware of that. He is a sustainer, of that universe. He did not leave it. Now, God is also capable, he is the only one capable of divine creation. Man can create, but as we talked about man's action, everything has to be set, all the right circumstances, remove all the obstacles, and so on. And it is still dependent on the will of God. Now, God's creation, he plans, he executes, and he creates from nothingness. And he creates it in the best way possible. This is what we have in the Quran about God's creation. So God does not depend on providing all the proper circumstances, removing all the obstacles, and then depending on something else for creation to happen. He is the one who creates. When he has the will for it to be, then it is. This is what God says in the Quran. And so, in comparison to man's action, God is the only one capable of divine creation. Nothing stops, or God does not depend on anything for him to create anything. And this is not so in the case of man. Now we have discussed cloning and man's abilities, and we talked about God's dominion and the actions of God. Now, before we put everything together and come out with the answer to this question: should our ability to clone humans negatively affect our belief in the existence of a creator, I just want to talk a little bit about human nature. Now, I don't want to attempt to explain the nature of man. It is complex and it's beyond this recording. What I want to do when talking about the nature of man is just to introduce the listener to the complexity of human nature, that man is not just the body. This is what I want to, the argument that I want to make from this slide, is that man is not just the physical component that we see. He also has a metaphysical component. This is according to the Islamic worldview. He has a soul, a metaphysical component which we don't know much about, the nature of it or anything. But God breathed into man that metaphysical component. And so also God talks about man. When he addresses man, he also addresses the human heart. He talks about the human heart as the place where a connection to God is. It's not just the physical human heart. Okay, when God talks about the human heart, he says, only he will be happy who comes before God with a heart free of evil, or comes to God with a sound heart. And so the status of that heart actually determines our spiritual place. And so the connection of the heart, soul, and the body, it's complicated, and it's not something that can be explained in this presentation. And also God addresses the human intellect. He asks the human, he presents a lot of signs in the universe and asks the human being to reflect upon all these signs. He appreciates the intellect of man. And so also God addresses something else which he calls the nafs, or the inner self in us. And that this nafs at the end, the one that is content is the one that is going to be happy and when coming back to God. And so from all of this, I just want to highlight the fact that in the Islamic worldview, man is not just his body. It is a very complex story, and that the soul is only put in humans by God. It's breathed into man, and it is only through God's action of creation that man lives, because of God breathing that soul into man. And in the Islamic theology, every soul, God says in the Quran, that every soul shall have a taste of death in the end. To us shall ye be brought back. So it doesn't really matter how long we live, even if scientists created something that if we take, it will make us live longer. That does not go against our belief system. Okay, they can grow, for a longer period of time, but at the end, they cannot live forever. They have to die. There is no immortality in Islam. And this we will discuss when we talk about cloning and the ramification that we are creating immortality. So this is briefly the nature of man and the complexity of that nature. So now if we want to put everything together to answer this question, should our ability to clone humans negatively affect our belief in the existence of God or a creator? I want to answer this question by dividing it into three questions. Is human cloning a divine act of creation? Does cloning defy God's authority and reign over the universe? Does cloning give humans immortality? By answering these, I hope we can put the main question to rest. Is human cloning a divine act of creation? Now we talked about the actions of humans, and we talked about the divine act of creation by God, and we compared them. So I'm just going to highlight what I mentioned before, is that man is not creating out of nothingness when he does cloning. If we remember the slide about cloning, he's starting from a skin cell which God has created, and he is starting from an ovum which God has created. So what man is doing, he's just exchanging genetic material. Took out the genetic material here, put it in the ovum, zapped it with electricity, and it developed as it would God created it to develop. So actually man did not create anything from nothingness. If I have a stereo TV system that is so complicated and I learn how to use it, that does not make me the creator of the system. And this is what happens, is man has the ovum, has the skin cell. He just exchanged nuclei and zapped it. And so he did not create out of nothingness. So that is not a divine act of creation. Man still has to provide all the right circumstances for the ova, for the skin cell, to zap it with electricity, to provide a womb for, and he has to go through the process that God originally created. And then still, after he provides everything, he cannot actually clone a human. He cannot will it to happen if God does not make this process happen. So is human cloning a divine act of creation? No, it is not. Does cloning defy God's authority and reign over the universe? Now we explained the dominion of man and the dominion of God. Now God created all the universe, seen and unseen. And he created man, he gave him the abilities, and so God, with his knowledge, always knows what man is capable of doing and what man is actually doing. So man cannot surprise God with something that he's not actually made up to do, because God gave him those abilities. Now the teacher, when we go back to our analogy of the teacher in the classroom, the teacher does not own the classroom. She can just use the classroom to fulfill the purpose. But there is an owner to the classroom who made everything in the classroom. So the teacher's ability to use it does not really threaten the owner's, the fact that another person or a school or the government owns the classroom. So man can make and create in the dominion that God gave him, but still he cannot defy the authority and reign of God. For example, in vitro fertilizations, which is, as I said, part of human cloning, you can exchange the ovum, you can put them, but at the end you can put the embryo in the womb. Even in vitro fertilization, you put the embryo in the womb. But if God does not breathe his soul into that embryo, then you don't have a human being developing. So it doesn't matter what man does, he is still under the authority, under the will of God. God has to breathe the soul into that clone or human in order for him to develop. And only God can do that. Does cloning give humans immortality? Now we have to look at 3 points to answer this one. Man has a physical component, yes, but he also has the metaphysical component, the soul. Even if scientists are able to clone the physical body, they can never really put a soul. Therefore, man cannot give immortality to a clone, since he cannot give the soul to the clone. If we consider cloning is creating immortality. So the act itself, to start with, is dependent on God, and man cannot do it. The second point is explained by looking at identical twins. If we look at identical twins, how they evolved, they actually started from a single fertilized ova. The ovum split during its development and made 2 identical embryos. They have actually more identical genetic material than a clone has. I don't want to go into the detail of the clone, but identical twins have more identical genetic material than a clone has to its source, to the original person. Okay, now if we look at identical twins, can we say these two are identical personalities, have identical souls, are exact copy of the same person? Even now, or in any society, or whatever our belief or worldview is, we don't look at identical copies it's the same person but just two copies of them. If one makes a mistake, the other one doesn't get to be punished for it because they're not the same person. And so if we carry that same logic into clones, even if I get to clone genetically identical person, it is not going to be the same person. It does not have the same soul. It does not have the same personality or anything. And so we are not really creating immortality this way because it is not the same person. And therefore, the last point is that God said every soul will have a taste of death. So even if we get to have drugs that will make us live longer, that is not immortality. There is no immortality. In conclusion, then, because man did something that seemed impossible a few years back, does not mean that man acted beyond his domain, or that he challenged the authority of God. The fact that we are discovering the intelligent design of the universe and of the creation of human beings, even if we get to manipulate what we discover, this is still within our God-given abilities. It does not eliminate the existence of a maker. All this becomes clear if we have the proper worldview, a worldview that puts God, man, and the universe in the appropriate perspective. And the only view that is able to do that is a view created by the Creator himself. Thank you very much. I hope this helps.